So soon after its independence, Ukraine made a choice for European integration. However, the country's path to the EU has been uneven over the past 3 decades. What political conditions characterize Ukraine's path to the EU today? How the war and EU conditionally influence the dynamics of reforms in the country? How does the situation differ across policy sectors? And what does the simultaneity of war and accession mean for Ukrainians, both in Ukraine and in the EU? So these questions are dealt with in the freely accessible edited volume, Ukraine's Thorny Path to the EU, from integration without membership to integration through war. And today we are very lucky to have the 2 editors of the book here, Marina Rabinovich and Anna Pinch, and also an author of one of the chapters of the book, Natalia Halecka. Warmly welcome to you. Anna, you will be our first presenter. Anna is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science and Management at the University of Agder in Norway, and she is also leader of Hromada, Nordic-Baltic Knowledge Network for the Rebuilding of Ukraine. Between 2021 and 2022, Anna was principal investigator of the research project Lowering the Bar Compliance Negotiations and the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement funded by the Research Council of Norway. Her research interests include the relations between Ukraine and the European Union, European integration, EU enlargement, and external democracy promotion. And Anna, today you will speak about the political conditions of the Ukrainian accession process. Welcome, Anna. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, dear Marta, and thank you, dear Ukrainenet Plus colleagues, for inviting us and for giving us the opportunity to present this book and make people aware of it. It's freely available, so we hope that many people have a chance to look at it. You see it here. It's a result of a project that Marta has just mentioned, of a project funded by the Research Council of Norway, and Marina was working on this project at the University of Agder together with me and our colleagues at Ukrainian Catholic University. Our project partners contributed 2 chapters in this book, actually. So I want to very briefly introduce you to the political conditions of the Ukrainian accession process before my colleagues take over and look a little bit more into some sectoral processes. Now I have to go on. Yes, so I will very briefly introduce you to the accession process, but this can be, of course, very brief only. Say something about the challenges, then Ukraine's European integration in general and how it has developed, the association agreement, which is still important today, and reforms and the path ahead. So here you can see an overview from the book on the key steps of the accession process, and I will not go through them step by step because this is a long and complicated process. Ukraine has opened accession negotiations, so this is where we are now. This is where the arrow is, and you see that a couple of steps have already been passed, but that does not mean that the kind of pace will be kept and that this will be a quick process from step 6 to step 9, because now we are coming from a kind of sprint that we had in the last years to the marathon, namely when the actual negotiations start, and over 30 chapters with European law have to be opened and closed, and Ukraine has to transpose all these laws into national legislation. And what is important to mention is that the EU member states, so 27 countries, have a right to veto basically every step, every opening of the chapter, every closing of the chapter, and of course, in the very end, when it is about the final green light for Ukraine to become a member of the EU. So we have already seen in the last years that this process may see very big challenges. On the one hand, we have, as I just said, member states that can block the process at any time because every one of them has the right to veto. And we have seen that, for instance, Orban in Hungary has made use of this opportunity when it came to financial support to Ukraine. But he has also been or put his foot on the brake when it came to going further in the accession process. So this is a constant challenge that will be there for the next years. And also from the level of society, there are challenges. Here's the example of Polish farmers protesting against the import of Ukrainian grain. And we may expect more such challenges when the market is liberalized. So these are just some examples. There are, of course, more we can discuss maybe in the Q&A about other challenges. This is a graph from one of the contributions by Christian Freudelsberger and Frank Schimmelpfennig, who looked over time how Ukraine has become more and more integrated to the EU. So what we see here on this graph is actually that we should not take the year 2022 as a point of departure when Ukraine formally applied for membership in the EU. But we should actually go further back, and they got back here to even before the association agreement was signed. And we see that over the years, there has already been a steady process of Ukrainian integration into the European Union's policy. So what they say is that basically the European Union's borders became less and less closed. So this is why the line goes down, because the closure decreases and Ukraine gets closer and closer to the European Union. And of course, then there is some more steep increase or decrease here after or in 2021 and 2. And the reason for going back also in the book even further than the Ukrainian application for EU membership is that we do not start from scratch. So when Ukraine submitted this membership application, a lot of work has actually already been accomplished, both in terms of building structures between the European Union and Ukraine and in terms of implementing European law into Ukrainian law. This is covered in 2 chapters here in the book, namely one by Rilka Dragneva and Katarina Wolczuk, who look at the association agreement that was finally signed. And this is also a story in itself, as you know, in 2014, entered into force fully in 2017. And they look a little bit back on the origin of this agreement and also the impact it had for the time when there was integration without membership, namely without an accession perspective. As we know, the European Union has been very reluctant to give Ukraine a membership perspective before 2022, and the association agreement actually was more a mechanism of keeping Ukraine out. Even though it was directed towards integration, it was also a mechanism to not let Ukraine into the EU. But they also point to capacity constraints that made it necessary to add additional mechanisms to this agreement to help Ukraine cope with the sheer amount of legislation that needed to be incorporated. And then there's another chapter by Peter von Elsoweke who looks into the future and what the association agreement can still mean now that we are on this accession path. And he says it's still valid and it's still useful to build the accession process on this association agreement. And it can also be a useful point of reference even for those areas that are not yet covered. Very briefly on the reforms and the path ahead. So what we see is that Ukraine has never been as closely integrated into the EU than it is today. Reforms are ongoing despite the war, and they have even accelerated in some fields. And this is based on various mechanisms. I will very briefly present those here. There's, of course, EU leverage. That means the EU has or uses conditionality by offering a reward and making Ukraine comply through this reward and through this leverage. But there are also practical requirements that Ukraine faces in dealing with the war and the consequences of the war that make Ukraine implement EU legislation. There's anticipatory compliance. That means Ukraine takes on European policies and law because it is useful with a view to the reconstruction. When we think about the Green Deal and the idea of a green reconstruction, so Ukraine actually goes beyond what was necessary with this anticipatory compliance. And finally, implementing reforms and implementing EU law is also a kind of ideological recovery and getting over the Soviet past. So it's not only EU pressure and it's not only the requirements, but it's also a kind of ideological component here, breaking with the Soviet past. The association agreement continues to be useful, but still needs to be combined with other instruments, especially enhancing the capacity of the administration. And there are some potential challenges apart from the ones I have just mentioned, and I think Marina will go into more detail here, namely when it comes to the danger of rising Euroscepticism, especially when the reforms do not deliver results maybe as quickly as Ukrainians wish. Yes, with this, I would like to close my presentation. Thank you for your attention. And I would like to pass the words then, maybe to Martha first. Thank you.
Yes, I will introduce our next speaker. Thank you so much, Anna. So our next speaker is Natalia Halecka, to whom we are especially grateful for taking the time to travel here to Oslo from Lviv. Natalia, she holds a Master of Law degree from Ivan Franko Lviv National University, Ukraine, and a Master of International Law and Economics degree from the University of Bern in Switzerland. While working for one of the largest law firms in Ukraine, Vasil Kisil and Partners, she has been involved as a legal advisor in trade investigations and trade disputes. Natalia has been teaching at the School of Law of the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv since 2018 and has been in charge of the Master in Law program since 2023. She is an attorney at law and leads the Lviv regional branch of the Ukrainian Bar Association. And in 2020, Natalia was elected as a member of a local self-government body in Ukraine, Lviv Regional Council. She chairs the Commission for European Integration and Integrational Cooperation, as well as the supervisory board of the Lviv Agency of Regional Development. Natalia's research interests include EU law, international law trade, and legal theory, and her presentation is titled Legal Aspects of EU-Ukraine Bilateral Trade Regulations During the Full-Scale War. More trade liberalization, but under conditions. Welcome, Natalia, and the floor is yours.
Dear Marta, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the inviting. It is my distinct pleasure to be here and to present a work which was performed by me by an invitation from Anne and Marina for over 1 year. And this is a result of this work, a chapter in the book. While presenting this chapter, I decided to update it a little bit with recent developments, which are actually not reflected in the book, but which show that the topic is rather dynamic. How to move slides here? Okay. Just a second. I need a second slide. Yes. Yes. So what were the research questions in my chapter? First research question was how the war has affected the implementation of the EU-Ukraine Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement in the broad context. So do we have more trade liberalization or less trade liberalization? And what were the lessons learned from the DCFTA implementation during the war? Which legal instruments are needed on Ukraine's way to the EU accession and reconstruction? And while researching this topic, I have learned that changes were made at different levels, and they were not always coherent and consistent. So there were changes at the EU-Ukraine bilateral level, changes separately at the EU level, at the level by EU member states, and there was a separate Ukraine's regulatory response. And I finalize with the suggestion of further next steps, and I'll also update with the situation currently. So if we speak about EU-Ukraine bilateral level, we can further divide changes that were made after February 2022 into three groups. Those that would have taken place anyway, even without the full-scale invasion, these amendments to the association agreement. So our association agreement is a very living instrument, so it constantly changes, and this is not always Ukraine which asks for these changes. The very first change was implemented due to the request from the European Union, due to the imports, due actually to the exports of chicken meat from Ukraine to the European Union, and there were certain changes which had to be made, and they were actually completed even after the full-scale invasion. Second group, those that took place due to the full-scale invasion. So this is arguably granting Ukraine the EU candidate country status and execution of the agreement on the carriage of freight by road transport agreement. And the third groups, those that would have taken place without the invasion, but were arguably stopped by it, conclusion of the agreement on conformity assessments and acceptance of industrial products. If we talk about the first group, so these changes that were inevitable, for example, we have updated the annex to the association agreement on customs legislation. It was revealed that without this change, the customs formalities took too much time, and it was very complicated to export goods from Ukraine to the European Union and vice versa. That's why it was envisaged that this change has to take place. It was drafted long before the full-scale invasion, and it was implemented after the full-scale invasion. So it did not stop the implementation of this annex in law and in practice. Although I will later show the map that unfortunately not all border checkpoints were subject to this implementation due to the full-scale invasion. EU candidate status. So Ukraine is a European country, and no one had doubts that at some point in time there was a possibility for Ukraine to get the candidate status, but to get it during the full-scale invasion, it was a clear political sign, and this full-scale invasion has actually make it faster. However, Ukraine was prepared itself for this status because Ukraine fulfilled all formalities, filling all questionnaires very promptly in order to make this happen. Another change, which was not possible without the full-scale invasion, it was the simplification of transportation between European Union and Ukraine. Before the full-scale invasion, there was this system of bilateral agreements between Ukraine and European Union on transport permits, which was very complicated, which did not respond to real trade flows, and which caused bottlenecks at the border. After the full-scale invasion, the system was simplified, and basically European Union took the competence from member states and concluded this agreement with Ukraine directly, so replaced these bilateral agreements. However, it was done just for 1 year. So from 2022, it was already extended 3 times. And right now, the deadline for the expiration of this system is June 2025. And we can witness what was happening like learning by doing, because at the very beginning this agreement was very liberal, but later when parties started to use this agreement, they learned that there are certain obstacles, certain concerns from member states. So it was updated with safeguard clauses, with different provisions. It has become more elaborate and with few safeguards. So right now it has more details, but it still exists, and this is very good. Notably, this agreement has not become part of the association agreement as such. So this is separate instrument which is not perpetual. And for Ukraine, this is a disadvantage because it can always be terminated. Um, if we go to the last subgroup of regulatory changes at the EU-Ukraine bilateral level that would have taken place without the invasion, but were arguably stopped. Actually, the EU mission on the conclusion of agreement on conformity assessment was supposed to visit Ukraine just a few months before a few months after the full-scale invasion. So the visit was set, but unfortunately it was postponed. And until now, we do not have this agreement concluded, which actually makes it more complicated for Ukrainian producers to export goods. Worth pointing out that this possibility to conclude this agreement is even envisaged in the association agreement as such. So this was like a plan of the implementation, and it failed to be completed due to the full-scale invasion. But hopefully, it will be completed. This year or in the next year. What else has changed? There are some negative changes which are not reflected in the changes to the association agreement. However, it really happened. The association agreement contains a number of clauses which can be used by Ukraine, for example, trade remedy, investigations, subsidies. But Ukraine cannot actually use it, cannot fruitfully benefit from it due to the full-scale invasion. So basically, we have some dead norms in our agreement, and there are plenty of examples when we have launched a trade investigation before the full-scale invasion, but it was not completed because of national interest and because it was not possible. So the association agreement does not reflect not all flexibilities that are provided there can be used. If we move to unilateral changes, there are some at the European Union level, and there are certain measures taken by member states. If we speak about European Union level, this is all regulations and implementing regulations which were taken starting from 2022. And similarly, as we draw transport agreement, we can see the change of the content of these regulations. The very first regulation on quota-free, tariff-free importation of Ukrainian goods into the European Union as of May 2022 was very broad, no disclaimers, no specific provisions. And later it has become more conditional, more safeguard clauses, more detailed, more subject to specific conditions. So it shows that at the very beginning, it was rather a measure of an economic support. And later it has become a regulatory measure, really regulating trade between European Union and Ukraine. Again, this is a unilateral measure adopted by the European Union, which is not a change to the association agreement. So for Ukraine, this can be an issue because it's just for 1 year. Each year it continues, but still it's not perpetual. And what we can state as of now, we have less trade liberalization, more conditions. So if we compare with the situation as of 2022, we have two conditionalities: non-trade conditionality. So access for Ukrainian goods to the European market is conditioned under Ukraine's respect for democratic principles, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, and respect for the principle of the rule of law, as well as the continued and sustained efforts with regard to the fight against corruption and illegal activities. And the second, we also have a safeguard clause, purely economic, with respect to the following products: eggs, poultry, sugar, oats, maize, groats, and honey. And this second measure is actually a reaction of the European Union to the protest which was mentioned by Anna at the border, and which I will deal in my next slides. So basically, this is a conversation inside the European Union happening between the European Union institutions and member states, and trying to put all the conditionalities into this regulation in order to ensure that that the trade in Ukraine is regulated under the terms which is accepted by everyone in the European Union. And here we see that unilateral measures were adopted by European Union member states, and this actually the regulatory response, which should not have happened, but unfortunately it had happened, and it shows that there is a need, that maybe there is a need of certain discussion inside the European Union, how a European Union as a supranational organization should react to such situations, because there were unilateral prohibitions of imports, transit of agricultural products by Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria at different times during this period, and actually prolonged customs and border formalities combined with the lack of border checkpoints. So it shows that competencies of the European Union member states and the European Union are still very strong as compared with the competencies of the European Union and European Union institutions, and there should be a discussion on future steps and how it should function. Also, there were uncontrolled protests at border checkpoints, which finally stopped, more or less stopped this year, once the European member states, especially Poland, has recognized these border checkpoints as a critical infrastructure. So they did a legal step in order to normalize the situation, normalize situations at the border. At certain point in time, Ukraine has even submitted the request for consultations in the WTO, which is an incredible step, which also should not have been done. But it generally, luckily, as of now, we do have a regulation taking into account concerns of the European Union member states and understanding from the EU member states that the trade at the border should be normalized. But these 3 years, this was a conversation. And here you can see two maps. On the right side, you can see the it's really very bright. So, but in general, the western border is open for exports. All other border checkpoints are closed. So you can see there are some border checkpoints in the Black Sea which are right now deblocked, which through which we can export, but otherwise we cannot export through other border checkpoints. So this is really critical situation, and the response of EU member states bordering Ukraine really matters. So they can really make a change. On the map, on the other map, you can see that not all border check. It's a little bit outdated, but in general, the trend stands the same. That not all border checkpoints are equipped with necessary infrastructure in order to accept all types of products, including exportation of goods, animal goods, so that's why there are just few border checkpoints through which goods can be exported or imported. What was the Ukraine's regulatory response after the full-scale invasion? First of all, institutions responsible for the European integration has continued to operate. They have been operating because Ukraine is a very digital country. It was possible to continue operations of all necessary ministries and governmental offices to continue their work. this has explains the fast movement with the candidate status. So we managed to fill all necessary questionnaires to provide the response and move with this. Also, Ukraine joins NSOE, European Association for the Cooperation of Transmission Systems Operators, at the beginning of March 2022. And it's a remarkable move because after the full-scale invasion, still Ukraine did not stop and implements what was envisaged before the full-scale invasion. Ukraine has also conducted a self-assessment initiative on compliance of Ukrainian legislation with the European Union law, and starting from the last year, and it continues with this year, Ukraine is equipped to start negotiations with the European Union on these 30 plus chapters, because we had already conducted self-assessment. Ukraine has partially and temporarily modified the trading regime with its trading partners by limiting imports of goods to critical imports and limiting payments for services and intellectual property. But this was for a short period of time, and in general, Ukraine's trading regime remains very liberal, even though Ukraine is a country in war. Unfortunately, there is not much policy space left for Ukraine. So with respect to regulation, we do not really have any mechanisms to utilize trade remedies to support our national producers with subsidies, or we also have a limited possibility to conclude new free trade agreements due to the accession, because they will be of temporary nature. And we have a very limited possibility of using local content requirements. So what can be the conclusions and what can be the next steps? So first of all, Ukraine has received a clear political sign of its candidacy. Association agreement, and especially its trade part, deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, is broadly implemented, and it's shown by unilateral measures adopted by the European Union and bilateral measures of signing the ROD agreement. Ideally, bilateral and unilateral measures have to be synchronized as an amendments to the association agreement, if this possible. And there should be more discussion in the European Union how European Union institutions can encompass all the concerns from the European Union member states and move forward with the accession of Ukraine. So concluding, the liberalization was temporary, conditional, and unilateral, and these trade liberalization measures were adopted at different levels, which maybe created certain contradictions with them. But they created a ground for future negotiations and for future Ukraine's accession. So thank you for your attention. I'm available to your questions.
Thank you so much, Natalia. I will present our last speaker today, Marina Rabinovic. Marina, she's a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Social Science at UIT, the Arctic University of Tromsø. She's also affiliated with the Kyiv School of Economics in Ukraine, and her research interests include EU external relations, EU-Ukraine relations, and local governance and resilience in wartime Ukraine. Marina holds a PhD in law from the University of Hamburg and a Master of Laws in European and European legal studies from the University of Hamburg and Europe College Hamburg. Welcome, Marina. The floor is yours. You will speak about the people's dimension of Ukraine's thorny path to the EU.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marta, and I hope that the online audience can also hear well. Yeah, I think now it should be better. And I'm going to probably serve as a little bit of a juxtaposition to what Natalia has presented, in a way that I'm going to speak not about the things which are happening on the paper, but much more about things which are happening with people. And I'm going to cover part of the book which deals yeah, which deals with people. And first thing I would like to say is that the confluence of the war and European integration has impacted people in Ukraine in plenty of ways. And here on this word cloud, I tried to put some of that. And these are the words which basically characterize the lives of many people. And I'm just wondering, so try to play a little bit with the audience, whether there is something which you may wonder about, something which you may not have heard or don't have an idea why this is important or what this relates to from everything you see. Yeah, I knew that this would be something that, yeah, one would ask, but this is actually a set thing. It's it belongs to one thing, the torture camp on the Paradise Street, and that is the book by Stanislav Aseev, the person who has been in Russian captivity for a long time in Donetsk. But quite ironically, the place where his camp was located was on Paradise Street. This was the former name from Donetsk. So some people, and I knew that somebody would pick it up, experienced very difficult things, but also managed to find some irony there. And some people, are much more probably troubled while diving into nostalgia and saying that still residing somewhere in Norway or in Finland, but still I'm living in Ukraine, the way that, you're kind of divided in different countries. Also, there are many people who are trying to build a new life in Europe and doing this, for example, Ausbildung in Germany, finding the new profession, or doing introductions program in Norway. So some people are busy with learning new things abroad. Some people are busy trying to reestablish their lives as internally displaced people in Ukraine. Somebody is building more links with the EU by participating in different projects. And now there are many more opportunities for Ukrainians to participate in Horizon Europe, in Erasmus, in different exchanges, which exist basically for a long time, but become more and more open to Ukraine. At the same time, this is not the case for many male people who are not allowed to leave Ukraine. So if you ask each specific person in Ukraine, his or her life would in any case be impacted in a war somehow. And probably it's a better thing to be learning something in a new country rather than being an IDP and trying to conquer a complicated bureaucracy in Ukraine. The worst thing definitely is being on a Paradise Street. And anyway, there have been a lot of changes to the destinies and to choices people are making. And there are multiple destinies, but unfortunately just 2 book chapters that we could have dedicated to what is happening to people and how people are perceiving this. And the first one was co-written by Valeria Lazarenko from Humboldt University and myself, which is focusing on collective protection and on how it is being formulated by the EU in the legal level and how it's being implemented in different member states. And the second one is by Konstantin Fedorenko, and it's about the prospects of Euroscepticism in post-war Ukraine, and also cover why it's so important to also speak about this while the war is still ongoing and the European integration is accelerating, as the previous speakers have said. So when it comes to collective protection, there are currently around 4.2 million Ukrainians who are under this status in the EU, and it means that they can be residing in the Union, having access to labor market, having access to health system, social services, and education, other things. But everything is temporary. And initially, the directive has been just for 3 years, and it stays so. But the European Union made an exception for Ukraine, and currently this directive will act until 2026. So the directive is such an instrument which doesn't directly apply in member states. It means that member states should implement it. So it sets the common objective, and the common objective is to provide, let's say, room for Ukrainians, host them while the war is ongoing. However, member states decide themselves how they implement this set of rights which the directive provides for. So this is a minimum, let us say, but how exactly they implement it can be very different. And in this chapter, we distinguish three models, how different member states implemented this collective protection using the multi-level governance perspective. So we look at the level of the state, of the national legislation, but also at the regional level sometimes, and when required, at the cooperations between state, regional level, and also NGOs and volunteers. And we found that, for example, Germany is focused very much on labor market integration and has reached quite much success in it, also with the program which is called Job Turbo, when it tries to integrate people to the job market as soon as possible and make them learn a language there. In Sweden, there is a so-called refugee track, meaning that Sweden was quite reluctant to integrate Ukrainians until recently. They even didn't have the personal numbers, which would make it difficult to access different services. And finally, Poland and Czech Republic had been quite agile in a way that they have made quite many changes into how they treat Ukrainians, but also there in these countries, there has been a lot of cooperation with NGOs, especially when it comes to organizing language courses, some kind of social activities and so on. Also, they have had probably least resources, but most creativity in terms of these multi-level and multi-actor cooperations. And we conclude by arguing that there is a need for the so-called dual integration approach, dual intent approach, which means that the EU shouldn't press all Ukrainians go back to Ukraine after the war finishes. Neither the EU or member states can really do it in such, let's say, a unified way, nor Ukraine can make everyone back. Rather than the OECD developed this dual intent concept, meaning that it would be accepted that some people come back, some people decide to stay, and it should integrate them the way that both options remain open at each point of time, so that the person can always make a decision herself or himself. And the second chapter about the people, at the time, it's dedicated to Euroscepticism, as I said. At the time when we were making the book, it still sounded a little bit exotic in a way. Why should it be a Euroscepticism in a country that just got a candidacy status and is so high on this euphoria for joining the EU soon? However, now, unfortunately, it looks much more realistic, and it discusses the discourses in the wartime in Ukraine, which may foster Euroscepticism. It also dives quite deep into the history of Euroscepticism, the notion, and how different Eurosceptic moods have existed in Ukraine before the war, which is quite interesting given all the complicated story of Ukraine being in between Europe and Russia a long time, different politicians trying to navigate this landscape. So I'm not an expert on this. I cannot tell you much except for that you can find a lot of information in the chapter in a quite condensed way, including the quantitative assessments and information from various surveys, which shows the attitudes to the European Union among Ukrainians since quite a long time ago. And the wartime discourses are being analyzed qualitatively, and they show that already now in Ukrainian social media, in this, let us say, Ukrainian language speaking segment, you can find quite many Eurosceptic thoughts and ideas, which I would say one most popular would be to say that the West didn't provide enough military assistance to Ukraine, and this has been an intent, that the West wants the conflict to be long in order to exhaust Russia and make Russia not dangerous for the West, or that At the same time, Ukraine is morally superior because Ukraine fights for the West and the West is not fighting. Also, that there are many conspiracy claims which are arguing that it has been all somehow co-organized, the war, and that somebody could have stopped it, the US could have stopped it, but it didn't do it. So there are a lot of discourses like this, and they get more popular as the war drags on, and especially now under Trump, there are many more kind of retrospective analysis why Biden did this and that, and they are not just about America, they are also very much about Europe, given the fact that Europe and America are largely perceived as allies and as, so to say, the collective West. So unfortunately, this chapter gets more typicality, and I think one could have updated it with plenty of details regarding these discourses. So to summarize all this, the people's dimension is and will continue being very important in EU-Ukraine relations, and the scale of current, let's say, cleavages regarding people depends a lot on the dynamics of the war, on how long it will be, and also on how active the EU will still be in supporting Ukraine both militarily and economically. When it comes to collective protection, it's important that the EU adopts some common scheme on the way out from collective protection, so there is no much mess around the countries, with some countries trying to integrate Ukrainians, some offering some ways to work visa or permanent residence, while others saying just go home, and then this could cause a lot of attempts of intra-EU migration, which doesn't seem to be a good idea after several years of individuals staying in some country. It's important to accept that many will not come back, and many had come back after Kosovo war and other conflicts. And since it's not possible to really force people out, especially those who already acquired some other status than collective protection, it's important to hold the option of return open. And this means that Ukraine shouldn't also be too, let's say, oppressing in the way it formulates its policies directed at the people and their comeback, when it tries, to not give documents to men, to block accounts, to make people choose which tax residences they want to have. So it's important to be flexible and try to keep the doors open as much as possible. There is a danger of the cleavage, and it already exists between people who stayed in Ukraine all this time, people who moved abroad, and especially in the social media, you can find a lot of this discourse of citizens who shouldn't have political rights anymore because they hadn't spent their wartime in Ukraine, because they chose different country for this time and therefore shouldn't participate in elections or similar things. So also find this discourse quite dangerous and potentially leading to some drifts and shifts in the Ukrainian society. And finally, I find it important to try to integrate as much as possible the aid to reconstruction and aid to people. For example, recently in Ukraine, they have launched the new online solution, which is called Batkivshina, and it should provide support to people who want to come back from abroad in a kind of one window application. And things like this really require support from the EU, so that there are positive stories of comeback, and probably this incentive-based and the say easy one window approach would be something which could be much more helpful than the coercive measures the Ukrainian government could apply. Thank you very much.
So much, Marina. This leaves us with some minutes for questions, so I will ask Natalia and Anna to come back up here, and we'll have some questions from the audience. Any questions from the audience here in Oslo? Yes? Odne Osla?
Yes, hello. Odne Osland. I'm one of the coordinating persons in Ukrainenet. Thanks to all of you for very interesting presentations. I think you had a lot of new stuff that is not covered in Norwegian media so much, so that was very interesting. You talked about the importance of unitary approach within the EU to many of these issues. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on the, maybe it shouldn't be called Euroscepticism. You said, I don't know, Ukraine skepticism. You talked about Euroscepticism, but we see that there are quite a lot of different approaches to EU integration of Ukraine in various European countries. And I was wondering what is most important. Is it the economic parts that people are afraid of, you know, agricultural products being sold cheap in the market, or is it more political? In terms of some feel that it's important now to get on with renewing relations with Russia and are tired of the war and so on. Some are closer to Ukraine, some are further away. So I was wondering if you could say something more about these dynamics, and also whether you have seen some changes after the elections to European Parliament in last year, where you got quite a few parties from populist right parties that got more influence in the parliament, if that has affected in any way the speed of the integration. Thank you.
Oh, Marshall.
No, you can, I think you can go ahead and then we can have another question if we have the time. Okay, I'll give you mine.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so regarding the first question, yeah, regarding the first question, I meant that the EU should have some common scheme for transitioning from this collective protection directive, some common pathway for the member states. And since the collective protection directive is kind of an umbrella initiative on the EU level, it's logical that there should be something also on the EU level after the directive ceases to exist. There are already quite some policy briefs and suggestions how this could look like. There are suggestions which focus more on member states level, so that the member states, so to say, are encouraged to apply some solutions at their level, but there are also suggestions for EU level solutions, like the so-called reconstruction permit or accession permit, which would allow people to apply and in case they can sustain themselves, stay in the EU longer term. Also some suggestions to make changes to EU long-term residence directive. So there are quite big policy briefs and summaries on this, which you could look at. I think this is a very interesting question, whether and how the EU will handle it after the protection directive is over, also amidst different scenarios of how the war will finish and when this will take place. And regarding the second question, I cannot say much about the European Parliament elections as such, but definitely as the war drags on, this moment of solidarity, it also vanishes in a way that there are more and more issues which are coming to the surface. But for me, it's still the war which is the most important thing and the elephant in the room, because it depends a lot on how, again, and on which terms the war will finish. And this will, I think, define a lot when it comes to the future of relations with both Ukraine and Russia. And at the same time, I think that it shouldn't be a taboo to speak about the relations with Russia in the future in a way that the EU lacks the good Russia policy. It actually lacks anything pronounced on the future, also any pronounced scenarios, at least, which would be publicly available. I think that the EU should also not be afraid to think about this, even though many of the scenarios would stay on paper. Yeah, maybe Anne could add something about the European Parliament election, if you know something specific on this.
Yes, I mean, we have seen indeed an increase in these extreme right and populist parties. I think it has not played out yet in the sense that they have blocked anything. Also, they are not very united. That's also a good thing when we think about progress. Even though the parliament comes in at the very end, in a way, in this enlargement process, when it has to give the consent, I think much more important are the member states. And you have already now mentioned some of the challenges, right, with these protests regarding agriculture. So indeed, the European Union would have to reform the whole system of giving subsidies to agricultural firms or farms when Ukraine becomes a member. So this is a huge thing. That would be a huge reform. Also, there's, of course, the question about the budget, the EU budget as such, not just with regard to agriculture, but also those who are now net recipients of money basically from the EU would then become net payers, which is also a big problem. The EU would need to reform its institutions, cut down the numbers of commissioners, for instance, but also think about more qualified majority voting so that unanimity is abolished in some fields where it still exists. And this is also very much disputed, especially among those states that actually support Ukraine. They are in part the most resistant to institutional change because it would mean giving up sovereignty, which is dear to many countries in Eastern Europe, right? So it's a very complex picture. There are a lot of challenges and potential obstacles. So there is not just one single reason that may block this process.
Let's have one question from the chat and then we'll round up.
Yes, we have a question. I think it is Laura. It's to Natalia, I guess. Given the limitations with trade regulations that were discussed, what are nevertheless the areas that are most open for trade and investment in Ukraine, particularly considering the reconstruction phase?
To start the answer with, actually, Ukrainian trade policy is a very open one. Since Ukraine's accession to the WTO from 2008, Ukraine's trade policy was opening and more opening. And with the conclusion of the accession agreement, we have our tariffs are really very low, if any, at many our tariffs are really very low, if any, for many products. We do have certain limitations in export controls on military or dual-use products, naturally, which every EU member state has as well. What are the main areas of investment? I already sense there is an interest in, again, Ukraine defense industries. That's why many companies are visiting Ukraine just to understand what is happening and what are the technologies. With respect to the reconstruction is already happening, especially in the territories of the north of Ukraine, which was relieved from Russian occupation at the 2022 in April 2022. So I would think that agriculture would be an area of interest to potential investors, and also IT technologies in respect of services and also especially in military technologies, because they are rapidly developing because there is a need to protect our border.
Thank you so much. I think it's time to round up. Thank you so much to our speakers, Marina, Natalia, and Anna. And thank you to our audience, both physically and online. And Ukraine will organize more events this spring. So do follow our website, and you can also sign up to our newsletter. And thank you again for joining us this morning.